Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. We'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times radio expert analysis. I'm Philip Ingram, a former senior British military intelligence officer and NATO planner, and now commentator on all matters geopolitical, defence, security and anything else that people want me to talk about. The videos this week are absolutely fascinating, and as we head towards Donald Trump's inauguration, Russia continues to push forward in eastern Ukraine, but that is coming to a point where it's almost stalling, and it still hasn't taken the main objective of Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, we've seen an increase in fighting in Kursk. The Ukrainians launched an offensive, the Russians launched a counter-offensive, and trying to work out who is advancing is difficult at the moment. And we've seen the capture of 2 North Korean soldiers, which is significant. The Times' Maxim Tucker has been discussing how the North Koreans are struggling to adapt to modern warfare.
And the North Koreans are inserted into Russian units and they're given Russian uniforms, Russian equipment, so they can't easily be identified as North Koreans. But obviously they're speaking different languages. The radio intercepts are making clear that they're North Koreans. And visually you can see that some are North Koreans whereas compared to ethnic Russians. Now, they do seem to be quite well-trained troops and physically fit. This is what the Lieutenant Colonel was telling me. And they're good at kind of clearing houses and establishing positions inside villages, but they really have no ability to deal with the modern nature of warfare. They just don't understand that they're being spied on from the sky at all times. They're still hiding in tree lines and not realizing they can be recognized with thermal imaging cameras, and they're being taken out quite easily by drones as a result of that and suffering very heavy casualties. They also need to have Russian guides who are attached to them to show them where to go and help them interpret their surroundings, because it's so different from anything that they've ever seen in North Korea. And this unit had captured one of the Russian guides who was providing a lot of detailed information to the Ukrainians about how they work together.
So, Maxim, I just want to talk about your latest report, a recent report you've done. You've obtained the first account by Ukrainian forces of close quarters fighting with North Korean troops inside Russia. Who did you speak to and where were they?
I spoke to the 33rd Separate Assault Brigade. They're known as the Big Cats, and they were fighting in a village called Mnova in the Kursk region. This was actually a really important strategic battle because it's a place where if the North Koreans and the Russians had been able to take hold of that village, they could push on to Sudzha, the largest town that Ukraine has been able to occupy in Russia, and effectively cut off the Ukrainian advance deeper into the Kursk region. Recently, Ukraine has reinforced its efforts in Kursk and has attempted to take more territory inside Kursk, again as part of this attempt to have a better negotiating position when it comes to peace talks with Putin. And if some of those are the best equipped brigades, that they are the best trained units that are pushing forward into Kursk, and if they'd been cut off and the North Koreans had gone in behind them, then it would have been really difficult for the Ukrainians to escape from that.
And in the case of this village, which you write about, Maknovka, what's the situation now? And can you describe how the North Koreans were routed?
So yes, so the North Koreans had set up 3 machine gun positions inside this village, and they were trying to control the area using these positions, and they fortified the areas, and they came in by surprise. They'd flanked the Ukrainian units who weren't ready for them at the time. So this 33rd Separate Assault Brigade had to go in and clear them out in house-to-house fighting. They did do that, and obviously with the help of drones, which the North Koreans weren't using, that gave them an advantage. They also had the Ukrainians had tanks and armored personnel carriers, which they deployed inside the village, and they were able to drive out the North Koreans and hold on to the village. Now, the fighting in that village has been very fierce over the past couple of days. The Lieutenant Colonel said to me that in 2 days he saw 120 North Korean and Russian troops killed. In one incident, he said he saw in the space of 4 minutes about 15 North Korean troops killed by drone. So it was a very intensive battle. And after that, the Russians and North Koreans seem to have been driven out of the village, and they are not making any more attempts to take that village. And there have been radio intercepts from Russian officers suggesting that the North Koreans are not prepared to go back and try and take that village again.
And at the moment in Kursk on the ground, there isn't that much movement, though, is there?
There's been some movement of the Ukrainians trying to push further into Kursk, and there was reinforcements in an effort to do that. It hasn't got as far as the Ukrainians would have hoped, but a lot of what is happening there is still quite unclear. The Russians launched a counter-offensive to try and cut off the Ukrainians and put pressure on the units that are being reinforced. So there is still a lot of heavy fighting, but yes, as ever in this war, it's increasingly difficult to make territorial gains because as soon as you come out into the open, you're exposed to drones and you're exposed to artillery, and it's very, very difficult to make gains in the current environment, especially when it's so.
His insights are fascinating. He says the feedback that he's getting from the Ukrainian officers that have interrogated the North Korean soldiers and interrogated a Russian liaison officer to the North Koreans who's got a better oversight between what the Russians think of the North Koreans and how they're integrating, which is absolutely fascinating, talking about how they're actually very fit soldiers. Their good basic tactical ability is good, and they know how to fight into built-up areas. And he describes how they've attacked into a village and managed to hold buildings and to take the village. But what they didn't have was the ability to work in an all-arms environment, bringing different capabilities together and understand the wider all-arms threat. So they didn't understand how the threat that came from Ukrainian drones, from artillery. They were still concentrating themselves in places. They were still hiding in wood lines, but not recognizing that Ukrainian drones could still see them. And he describes how the Russian liaison officer had said he'd lost significant numbers of North Korean troops because of Ukrainian attacks against them, and how they'd been forced out of the villages that they'd taken. And to the point where North Koreans were actually refusing to go back into battle to retake the villages again. You get that sort of dispute amongst forces that are not properly integrated, and you're causing the commanders above that level an even greater headache. So the North Koreans, on one hand, are feeding the meat grinder. On the other hand, they're causing commanders at a higher level real difficulties, I think. We also then heard from General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and he's talking about the signs that Russia's push into the Donbas is slowing, and in part because of the Kursk offensive.
I mentioned what's been happening in Kursk, not just since August, but even in the last week or so, Ukraine ramping up offensive operations there. Do you think they're right to do that? And do you see that as part of them laying the groundwork ahead of potential peace talks?
It was a huge decision. Some people would call it a gamble. I don't call it that. The offensive in Donbas was continuing apace, and rather than throwing more force at that, Ukraine mounted an attack into Kursk. I happen to believe that it was a masterstroke. It will absolutely change the dynamic of any peace talks coming up. And I think that's why Mr. Putin is throwing everything, including the trash can and the kitchen sink, at Kursk to try to rectify that before any peace talks. So that's just my opinion. I'm just another person with an opinion. I think that this gambit, this approach, will affect future negotiations. And I think that who you believe, I don't know who you believe, but people I am reading now that are not the people who are tied to political positions, but just analysts of the war, they are saying that the Russian offensive in Donbas is nearly ground to a halt. Lots of reporting along those lines. And so if that's the case and that comes to a halt and Ukraine is still sitting in Kursk, then it appears that this was a masterful decision by Ukraine.
The Ukrainians went into Kursk to do two things. One, to take the fight to the Russians in a way that it would become more public to the Russian public, especially the European Russians, and two, to try and force the Russians to take some military capability away from the eastern fight in the Donbas and bring it into Kursk to counter that. The first worked well. The second didn't. The Russians didn't move any capability away. And it took them 6-7 months to build up a capability to start to counterattack against the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk and to push it back a little bit. They counterattacked in, they've pushed the Ukrainians back a bit, the Ukrainians have stopped them, and the Ukrainians are in the process of counterattacking the Russians again and pushing them out of different areas. Where that is and who is moving the front line in Kursk most at the moment is very confusing. The Russians have thrown a lot of North Koreans at it, and that's where North Korean soldiers, the 2 North Korean soldiers, have been captured. Interestingly, it seems that the North Koreans are either killing their own wounded or the Russians are killing North Korean wounded because they don't want live North Koreans to fall into the hands. They're wearing Russian uniforms, they're carrying Russian identity cards. They don't want people to know that these are just North Korean troops integrated into the Russian military. When it comes to the front line in the east, the Russians are making tiny progress for huge cost. 1,400, 1,600, 1,800, 2,000 dead or severely wounded a day. But it's not just the personnel, it's the equipment. And we're seeing other reports of the Russian equipment depots, their storage sites where they had tanks and armoured personnel carriers and artillery pieces virtually emptied. And as soon as they've run out of those, they've got nothing to put through their factories to get refurbished, to get out into the front line again. They're then going to have troops who are without any protection. The protection they've got is not surviving well at the moment. Not having any protection means they are totally vulnerable. 2025 is going to be a very interesting year for the Russians in the east. I feel that operations in the east have, for the Russians, stalled between the Russians and Ukrainians. It's a stalemate at the moment. Kursk, it's still very active. It's too early to tell who is making significant or any advances there. But what is significant is the Russians have failed so far to push the Ukrainians back out of Kursk and are putting a lot of effort into it in the run-up to Donald Trump's inauguration on Monday. So General Ben Hodges also discussed the DPRK, the North Korean troops fighting in Russia, and the capture of 2 of them, revealing orders that North Koreans are not to be captured under any circumstances.
Just finally, General, let's turn to the situation on the front line in Ukraine and also in Kursk. I mean, we haven't talked about it so much this time, but the geopolitics and what happens with Trump coming back, I think, is dominating so much at the moment. But what we have seen in recent days, for instance, is Ukraine reportedly capturing its first North Korean prisoners of war in Kursk. What should we read into that? In particular, Russia's increasing reliance, if indeed you think it is a reliance increasingly, on foreign troops.
So there's no doubt that Russia has a serious manpower problem, which is not something that most people would assume. But they have a manpower problem, which is why they're having to not only empty prisons, but also impress foreign workers that came into Russia thinking they were going to be working in some factory, and then they end up in a Russian infantry unit somewhere. And now about 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been put into combat. From talking to Ukrainian officers, I think that these 12,000 are divided up into 4 different brigades that are employed as just like Russian infantry. So their bodies basically into the meat grinder. I think President Zelensky reported the other day that it looks like about 3,000 of them have been killed or wounded. So already 25% have become casualties. And now you've got a couple that are captured. It'll be interesting to see what we learn from them, but it looks like North Koreans, to avoid being captured, are getting killed by Russians or their fellow soldiers if they're wounded, to avoid becoming captured in many cases. And unsurprisingly, at least one of the 2 said that he thought he was coming there for training. So there's a lot behind the scenes that we just don't know yet about these guys. What conclusions can we draw from this? The Kremlin still is reluctant to draft large numbers of troops out of Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want a bunch of funerals in those cities. Most of the casualties are coming from the regions outside of Russia's two main metropolitan areas. So that allows the Kremlin to say to operate without worrying about casualties. It'll be a different story if they are forced to have to draft troops from those two main cities. So I think the North Koreans are filler. They're more fodder for the meat grinder.
And as I was saying, it seems that they have been told to shoot their own wounded. The Russians have been told to shoot the North Koreans. The North Koreans are wearing Russian uniforms. They're carrying Russian identity cards to make them look as if they've come from the east of Russia, from those sorts of areas where you'd get similar facial features and everything else. But General Ben describes how electronic warfare is picking up communications intercepts where it's quite clearly Korean, North Korean that is being spoken. And Russian commanders are talking about the North Koreans in a way that can't be hidden. So their use on the front line is quite clear. And he's been talking about how there are reports of significant casualties amongst the North Korean troops that are there. And of course, now the Ukrainians have captured two and captured a Russian liaison officer with the North Koreans. We should get more intelligence out. But the North Korean soldiers were saying that they had thought they were being sent to Russia for a joint training exercise, not to go onto the front line. So again, a lot of the North Korean troops may not have been aware of what it is that they're going to do, and are certainly, looking at the way North Korea operates, won't know the wider intent of their commanders and where they're fitting in. And again, this comes out when the Russian liaison officer is there to try and tell them where to go, how to operate in the different terrain than they're used to fighting in, and where to go next. It shows that they have got no initiative. That could only be good for the Ukrainians, but very bad for the North Koreans. And if the Russians are relying on North Korea, very bad for them. So we're seeing pictures here of captured North Korean soldiers in hospital, and they're clearly wearing Russian uniforms. They've got Russian fatigues around them. They're clean Russian fatigues, so clearly they've been laundered. They will be surprised as to the level of care that they're getting. It's something that they probably won't have experienced beforehand. It wouldn't surprise me if they try and seek some form of asylum afterwards so as they don't get back to North Korea. But it all depends on what threats that there are to their families and elsewhere. What's coming out of the commentary from the soldiers is their lack of knowledge of the wider situation as to why they're there. But it'll be interesting as more and more get captured as to what additional intelligence the Ukrainians manage to get out of them. Ukraine is having huge success in attacking the Russian strategic infrastructure, in particular their oil refineries. And we're seeing pictures here of Russian drones and Russian rockets attacking oil refineries. And often they'll attack a refinery, wait until the fires have been put out, and then attack it again. These refineries are thousands of kilometers away from the front line. And what they're doing is they're attacking the storage tanks, which means that Russia has got less ability to store oil and oil products. That means that their production has to come down because they can't store it. But it's also attacking the refineries themselves and stopping them being able to refine crude oil into the products that are needed. This is significant because it's hitting the Russian economy significantly. It is the Russian oil and gas exports that are funding Russia's conflict. This, through 2025, is going to cause the Russians real headaches. So that's a recap of events of the week. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to put your comments below and we'll answer those in our Q&A sessions, and sign up for Times Radio membership for more exclusive content.